Daniel Whitmore thought he understood his marriage. He thought 15 years of quiet devotion had earned him a place in his own home, a right to know the woman who slept beside him. He didn't know that the wife he was about to leave had spent the last 2 of those years hiding a truth so heavy it would threaten to shatter everything he believed about himself, about her, and about the father he had buried. Within a single evening, one conversation overheard through a half-closed door would unravel a decade and a half of silence, and it would force a proud man to choose between the wounded pride that told him to walk away and the love he had never once learned to see. If you believe that the people closest to us sometimes carry us in ways we never notice, in ways we may never deserve, then stay with me until the very end of this story. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because what Daniel heard through that door is the kind of thing that makes a person question everything they thought was true about their own life. Let's begin. The suitcase sat open on the bed like an accusation. Daniel had packed it twice already, unpacked it once in a moment of weakness, and now he stood in the doorway of the bedroom he had shared with his wife for 11 of their 15 married years, wondering how a man arrives at this particular kind of quiet. He was 43 years old. He had a good job as a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm downtown, work he was genuinely proud of, even if no one under his own roof ever asked him a single question about it anymore. He had a daughter, Sophie, who was 13 now and who barely looked up from her phone when he walked through the door in the evenings. And he had a wife, Claire, who had somehow, over the slow and merciless accumulation of ordinary days, become a stranger who happened to share his address. It had not always been like this. Daniel could still summon, if he let himself, the version of Claire who used to slip handwritten notes into his coat pockets, the woman who had wept at their wedding, not out of nervousness, but out of a joy so complete it had frightened her. He remembered their first apartment with the radiator that banged all winter and never once produced heat, the nights they had eaten cheap noodles under a single lamp and laughed until their sides ached about how impossibly rich they were going to be someday. They had never gotten rich. They had gotten comfortable, and then they had gotten tired. And then, without either of them noticing the exact day it happened, they had gotten silent. And somewhere inside that silence, Daniel had slowly and completely convinced himself that Claire no longer saw him at all. The evidence, to his engineer's mind, was overwhelming and damning. She worked late almost every night at the small accounting practice she managed. She took phone calls in the other room, her voice dropping to a careful hush the very moment he came near enough to overhear. She had canceled their anniversary dinner 2 months earlier, with an apology so brief and so hollow it had felt like an afterthought scribbled on the back of a receipt, and most damning of all, she had stopped explaining herself entirely. There was a coldness in her now, a distance that lived behind her eyes when she looked at him, as though she were forever calculating some private sum he was not permitted to see the answer to. So, Daniel had made his decision, and he had made it the way he made every decision, slowly and then all at once. He was going to move out. He had already spoken to a colleague about a short-term furnished rental across town, a clean and anonymous place where no one would ask him how his day had been. He had drafted, in the courtroom of his head, the careful and reasonable speech he would give Sophie about how sometimes grown adults simply needed a little space to breathe. He had told himself over and over, until he almost believed it, that this was not a failure, but a kindness, that Claire would surely be relieved, that she had checked out of this marriage long ago, and he was merely doing them both the favor of making it official on paper. He zipped the suitcase halfway, and then he stopped. Something small and stubborn in him refused to leave without one honest conversation first. He owed her that much, he told himself, or perhaps he owed it to himself, to say the words out loud like a man instead of vanishing behind a folded note the way lesser men did. He would tell her tonight, face to face, at the kitchen table where they had once planned their whole lives. He rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror, absently straightening a tie he hadn't worn in months, and the man staring back at him looked a decade older than he felt and considerably more afraid than he was willing to admit. Claire's car pulled into the driveway. Just after 7, Daniel heard the familiar rumble of the garage door, the soft, precise click of her heels crossing the kitchen tile, the crinkle of grocery bags being set on the counter. And then he heard something he had not planned for, something that stopped the breath in his chest. A second voice. Marissa? Claire's oldest friend, the woman who had stood as maid of honor at their wedding, the one Claire disappeared to see on the rare and precious weekends she allowed herself. Daniel had never entirely trusted Marissa, not because of anything the woman had ever done to him, but because she knew things about his own wife that he no longer did, and that particular kind of exclusion had a way of curdling into suspicion. He stayed upstairs, telling himself he would simply wait until Marissa had gone home before he delivered his rehearsed speech. But the house was old, built in a decade when nobody worried about sound, and the vents carried voices from room to room the way old houses always do. As Daniel moved quietly toward the top of the stairs, he heard his own name spoken low in the kitchen below, and his feet stopped moving entirely, as though the floor itself had reached up and held him in place. "You still haven't told him," Marissa was saying. There was no accusation in her voice, only a kind of weary, patient concern. "Claire, it's been almost a year now. He deserves to know. You can't keep doing this to yourself." Daniel's hand tightened around the smooth wood of the banister until his knuckles ached. Here it was then. The confirmation of everything. The other man, the affair, the secret life he had suspected all along, and secretly, shamefully, almost wanted to be proven right about. He very nearly turned and walked back to his suitcase, rather than hear the words spoken aloud. Some cowardly part of him had already written the ending of this story, and did not wish to have its work corrected. But Claire's answer, when it finally came, did not fit any story Daniel had ever built. "How do I tell him, Marissa?" Claire's voice cracked open in a way Daniel had not heard from her in years, and the sound of it went through him like a blade. "How do I look at that man and tell him that I've been paying off his dead father's debt for 11 months straight, so that he never has to know his own dad lied to him? How do I tell Daniel that the reason I've been working every single weekend, the reason I canceled our anniversary, the reason I've barely slept a full night in almost a year, is that I have been quietly saving his family's good name so that he never once has to carry the weight of that shame?" Daniel stood frozen at the top of the stairs, and the whole world tilted slowly beneath his feet. "His father came to me," Claire went on, and now the words came faster and faster, as though a dam somewhere inside her had finally given way after holding back an ocean. 2 years before he died, Marissa, he was terrified. Genuinely, deeply terrified. He'd taken out loans against the old family house, the one Daniel grew up in, the one Daniel still believes to this day is paid off free and clear. He'd cow-signed things for that no-good younger brother of his, who has never paid back a dime to anyone in his life. Arthur was drowning, and he was so ashamed of it that he couldn't bring himself to tell his own son. So he came to me instead. He begged me. He sat right there at that table, and he said, "Claire, my boy worships me. He thinks I hung the moon. Please don't let him ever find out I was a fool with money. Handle it quietly for both of us." And so I did. I've been handling it alone for 11 months now. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the kitchen faucet running and then stopping, and then a silence so complete that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. "You've been carrying this entirely alone," Marissa said at last. Very softly. "You know what? Both of you were fools then. Him for asking such a thing of you, and you for saying yes to it without ever telling your own husband all these months. I couldn't tell him." Claire's voice dropped so low now that Daniel had to lean forward and strain to catch every word. "You don't understand what that man was to Daniel. You didn't know them together. His father was his entire world, his whole idea of what a good man was supposed to be, how a man carries himself, how a man keeps his word, Sis. And after Arthur died, the way Daniel spoke about him at that funeral, the way he still holds on so tightly to that memory like it's the only warm thing left, I could not be the one to take that away from him. I couldn't be the person who told him his hero was just a frightened, ordinary man who made mistakes, so I took the debt instead. I refinanced my practice. I've been sending payments to 3 different lenders every month, like clockwork. I sold my grandmother's ring back in March, and I've done the math 100 times over, and I can finally see the end of it now. 4 more months, Marissa. 4 more months, and it's clean. All of it gone. And then I was going to burn every last statement in the fireplace, and Daniel would go the rest of his life, believing his father was nothing but perfect. Daniel's legs simply gave out beneath him, and he sat down hard on the top step, his back pressed against the wall, his packed suitcase lying forgotten in the bedroom behind him, like the relic of a stranger's life. The grandmother's ring. He had noticed, months ago, that Claire no longer wore it on her finger, and he had assumed, in the private and vindictive courtroom of his own resentment, that she had simply stopped caring enough about anything to bother putting it on. He had built an entire prosecution out of her silences, and now every single piece of evidence he had so carefully gathered against her, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the canceled anniversary, the calculating distance in her tired eyes, every last one of them was revealed to be not the shape of a woman leaving her husband. It was the shape of a woman drowning quietly in order to keep him afloat. He thought of all those phone calls she had taken in the other room, her voice low. The lenders. He thought of the coldness he had so confidently read into what was nothing but pure exhaustion. He thought of every single night he had lain rigid beside her in the dark, silently composing his righteous little speech about space and honesty and needing room to breathe while she lay awake beside him, doing arithmetic in her head to protect a dead man's dignity and a living man's fragile heart. "He wants to leave you, doesn't he?" Marissa said. It was not really a question at all. There was a long and terrible silence in the kitchen below. "I found the rental listing open on his laptop," Claire said quietly, her voice hollowed out. "I know he's been packing his things. I've known for a week now. I haven't slept." Daniel closed his eyes and pressed the back of his head against the wall. "And you didn't say anything to him? You just let him? What was I supposed to say, Marissa?" Claire's voice had gone flat now, wrung completely dry. "Please don't go, but I can't tell you the reason I've been the way I've been. He is absolutely convinced that I don't love him anymore, and I cannot prove to him that he's wrong without shattering the one thing about his father that he needs, more than anything, to keep believing. So I made a decision. If he leaves, then he leaves. I would rather lose my marriage than have him lose his entire idea of the only man he ever truly looked up to in this world. That's what love actually is, isn't it, in the end? Choosing the harder thing when absolutely no one is watching you do it." Marissa said something, then too soft for Daniel to make out, and he heard the scrape of a wooden chair being pushed back across the tile, and then the low, muffled sound of a woman crying. And Daniel understood, with a clarity that landed on him like a physical blow, that the woman crying down in his kitchen was his wife. He did not go down the stairs. Not yet. He couldn't. A man does not simply walk into a room the moment he has learned that everything he believed about his own life has been turned completely upside down. He sat on that top step for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, and he let the entire towering architecture of his resentment collapse, beam by beam, joist by joist, until there was nothing left of it but rubble and shame. He was an engineer. He had spent his whole career building things designed to bear enormous weight, to distribute load evenly, to stand firm against forces that pushed and pulled at them from every direction at once. And he had failed, utterly and completely. for 11 long months, to notice that the person carrying the single heaviest load in his entire life had been standing quietly right beside him the whole time, saying nothing, bending silently under a burden she had chosen to lift precisely so that he would never have to feel its weight. He had mistaken her strain for indifference. He had mistaken her silence for absence. And he had, God help him, packed a suitcase with the full intention of leaving the strongest and most faithful person he had ever known, all because she had simply been too good at hiding how desperately hard she was working to protect him from the truth. The shame of it was physical, a sick heat that rose up his neck and settled behind his eyes. He thought of his father, Arthur, a proud man with a booming laugh and rough, calloused hands, a man who had taught Daniel how to bait a hook and how to shake another man's hand firmly and how to always, without exception, pay back what you owed. And now that very same man had asked Daniel's wife to shoulder a lie for him rather than confess a single failing to his own son. Daniel felt something complicated and enormous move through his chest, and it was not the pure, clean grief he had felt at the graveside. It was something older and more grown, and somehow more forgiving. His father had been a man, only a man, flawed and frightened at the very end of things, like anyone. And rather than let that ugly truth crush his boy, he had swallowed his enormous pride and asked for help. That was not the act of the flawless giant Daniel had eulogized, but it was, Daniel realized with tears sliding down his face, the act of a father who loved his son too much to ever be ashamed in front of him. When Daniel finally stood, his knees ached and his face was wet, and he did not bother to wipe it. He walked back into the bedroom, and he looked down at the open suitcase for a long moment, and then he unzipped it the rest of the way and began, slowly and deliberately, to put every single thing back where it belonged. His shirts folded into the drawer, his shoes paired into the closet, and last of all, the small framed photograph of the three of them squinting into the sun at the lake, the one he had packed first of everything, which he now set back onto the nightstand with a care that felt very much like an apology whispered to an empty room. He heard the front door open and close as Marissa let herself out into the night. He heard Claire moving alone in the kitchen afterward, the small, ordinary domestic sounds of a woman putting away groceries, because life stubbornly goes on, even when a heart is quietly breaking inside a chest. And Daniel made a decision then that felt larger than any decision he had made in years, larger even than the decision to leave, because it demanded of him something that leaving never would have. It demanded that he allow himself to be seen, that he admit out loud that he had been terribly wrong, that he let his wife know, whatever the cost, that he finally knew the truth. He came down the stairs. Claire was standing at the counter with her back to him, folding a paper grocery bag along its creases, with the mechanical, absent precision of a woman whose mind was somewhere very far away from her own hands. She stiffened when she heard his weight on the bottom step, and when she turned to face him, she had already, in that half a second, arranged her features into the neutral, careful, unreadable expression he now finally understood she had been wearing every day for 11 exhausting months. "Daniel," she said, "I didn't hear you come down. Is everything all right?" He looked at her for a long moment without answering. His wife, 41 years old, worn thin around the eyes, and still, somehow, the single most beautiful thing he had ever laid eyes on, more beautiful now than she had been, standing at the altar, because he finally understood exactly what she was made of underneath. "I heard you," he said quietly. "I was sitting on the stairs. I heard everything you told Marissa, all of it." He watched the color drain completely from her face. He watched her reach one hand back to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. He watched 11 months of iron control fracture and fall away in real time And before she could speak, before she could begin to apologize for a thing that required no apology in this world, he crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and took both of her cold hands in his own. "You sold your grandmother's ring," he said, and his voice broke apart on the words, and he let it break. "You sold your grandmother's ring, Claire, and I actually convinced myself that you didn't love me anymore. I had a suitcase packed upstairs. I was going to sit you down at this table tonight and tell you I was leaving. I built an entire story in my head where you were the one who stopped caring. And the whole time, this entire time you were." "Daniel, please." She was crying openly now, the last of her composure gone. "Entirely. Your father made me promise him. He was so afraid of what you would think of him if you ever knew. I only ever wanted to protect you from it." End quote. "I never wanted you to feel." "Stop." He said it gently, so gently, and he pulled her in against his chest, and he felt her whole body begin to shake with the sudden release of a weight she had been carrying, utterly alone for so long that she had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "Stop protecting me. Just for 1 minute. Stop. Let me hold you. Let me carry something. For once in this marriage. Please." They stood like that in the middle of the kitchen for a long time. 2 people who had come within one overheard conversation of losing each other forever to the very love that was supposed to hold them together. And Daniel understood, standing there, that his father's greatest failing had accidentally and completely revealed his wife's greatest strength, and that his own wounded pride had brought him within a single thin wall of throwing all of it away. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel wiped her tears away with the pad of his thumb, and he said, "Tell me everything. All of it. Every lender, every number, every payment you've made. I'm an engineer, Claire. I am good at load-bearing structures. It's the one thing I've always been good at. And you have been the only thing holding this entire house up for the better part of a year. It's time you let me take some of the weight off you." She hesitated because a year of secrecy does not simply dissolve in a single instant. "I'm so close to the end of it," she whispered. 4 more months, that's all. I didn't want you to ever have to know." "I already know," he said, "and I am not ashamed of him. Do you hear me, Claire? He was scared. He was human. He asked for help. That is not the memory of a weak man. That is the memory of a father who could not bear the thought of disappointing his own son. I love him more for it, not less. And I love you more than I have words in my whole body to say." He paused, and then he said the thing that mattered most of all. "Show me the numbers." So she did. That night, at the kitchen table, over 2 mugs of cold coffee and a shoebox full of statements she had kept hidden away in the very back of her closet, Claire finally opened the whole terrible, beautiful ledger of everything she had done. There were the 3 lenders. There was the paperwork from the refinanced practice. There was the record of the money from the ring. And there was a running total on a folded sheet of paper, updated faithfully in her small, neat handwriting, that showed a total debt of $60,000, of which she had, alone and entirely unaided, already cleared all but $19,000. Daniel stared at that final number for a very long time. $19,000. 4 more months of her exhaustion, her silence, her sleepless sacrifice. And then he stood and he walked to the small home office where he kept his own records, and he came back to the table with a folder of his own tucked under his arm. "There's something you don't know either," he said, and now it was his turn to feel the strange vulnerability of confession. "I've been quietly putting money into a separate account for 11 years now, since Sophie was 2 years old. I never told you about it because, honestly, because I wanted it to be a surprise for you someday. A cushion for us, a little house up at the lake, maybe something for the 2 of us when we finally got old." He set the statement down on the table beside her shoebox. "There's $22,000 sitting in it, and—" Claire looked down at the number and then up at his face, and something passed between them. In that kitchen, that 15 years of marriage had somehow never once managed to say out loud. They had both, in their separate and secret silences, been saving. They had both, without ever telling the other, been quietly building toward a future they were each privately terrified they might no longer share. And the entire time each of them had believed themselves completely alone in it. "We can pay the whole thing off tomorrow," Daniel said, "every last dollar of it. And then we are going to sit down together, the two of us, at this table, and we're never going to do this to each other again. No more carrying things alone. No more protecting each other straight into misery. Deal?" Claire laughed. Then a wet, broken laugh that was half a sob and half something like the sunrise, and she nodded, and she said, "Deal." "But Daniel, your father—" "My father would be grateful to you until the end of time," Daniel said firmly. "And so am I. And someday, when Sophie is old enough to understand it, I am going to tell her this whole story, not the part about the debt. That part doesn't matter. The part about the woman who loved her father-in-law's memory enough to protect it with everything she had, and who loved her husband enough to let him walk out the door rather than lose it. I want my daughter to know exactly what that kind of love looks like when she sees it, because I almost didn't recognize it myself, and it was standing right in front of me. The debt was cleared entirely within the week." Daniel called each of the three lenders personally, one by one, and there was a strange and unexpected healing in it, in taking his father's failing into his own two hands and settling it the way a son should have been allowed to settle it from the start. He felt closer to Arthur during those quiet phone calls than he had at any moment since the funeral. He forgave a man who could no longer ask him for forgiveness, and in the doing of it, he came to understand something true about the difference between the fathers we imagine and the fathers we are actually given, that the second kind, flawed and frightened and human, are the only ones ever worth truly loving. He got Claire's grandmother's ring back too. It took some real doing. He tracked the jeweler down through the pawn record, and though the ring had already been sold on once to another buyer, the jeweler, moved by the whole story Daniel told him across the counter, made a few phone calls of his own and managed to find it again, and Daniel bought it back for nearly twice what Claire had originally received for it. He did not tell her a word of it. He waited patiently until their anniversary, the real one, the one they finally sat down to celebrate several months late, and he set the small velvet box beside her plate at the very same cheap noodle restaurant where they had eaten together in the broke and hungry early days of their marriage, because he wanted, more than anything, to end where the two of them had first begun. She opened the little box, and she did not say a single word for a full minute. She only looked at the ring gleaming there, and then up at his face, and Daniel saw in her expression the exact woman from their wedding day, the one who had wept out of a joy so complete that it had frightened her. "I almost left you," he said quietly across the table. "I need you to know that, out loud from me. I almost walked out that door because I mistook your strength for coldness. And I am going to spend the rest of my life making absolutely certain that I never make that mistake about you again. I see you now, Claire. After all these years, I finally see you. And here is the thing I most want you to carry away from this story tonight, wherever in the world you happen to be watching from. So, very often we are entirely certain that we understand the people we live right beside, the people whose beds we share and whose faces we see every single morning. We read their silences as indifference. We read their exhaustion as distance. We read their absence as rejection. We build entire airtight cases against them in the quiet, unchallenged courtrooms of our own minds. And sometimes, far more often than any of us would ever care to guess, the very person we are quietly resenting is the exact same person who is carrying us, unseen and unthanked, through a storm we do not even know is raging all around us. Daniel Whitmore came within one overheard conversation of walking away from the single greatest love of his entire life, and he was saved from it. In the end, not by his own wisdom or his own goodness, but by nothing more than the lucky accident of an old house and a set of thin walls, most of us will never be so fortunate. Most of us will never happen to overhear the truth spoken aloud at exactly the right moment. So, the lesson is this, and I hope you hold on to it. Before you assume the very worst of the ones you love, ask them. Sit down together at the kitchen table and open the shoebox. Show each other the numbers, whatever your numbers happen to be. Because the weight that is quietly breaking your heart may well be a weight that someone else has been carrying for you in silence all along. And love, real love, the kind worth keeping, was never once meant to be carried alone. If this story moved you tonight, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. Stories about the hidden strength of ordinary people and the second chances they very nearly throw away with both hands. And I truly want to hear from you down in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone you loved only to discover much later just how wrong you had been about them? And where in the world are you watching from tonight? Tell me your own story below. I read every single one of them. I promise you that. And until the next time we meet here, remember this above all else, that sometimes the very person you are ready to give up on is the exact same person who never once, not for a single day, gave up on you.